adventure that we took is after we graduated from UC Berkeley, we shook hands on the plaza once after a very long and boring lecture that we both spent time in, and agreed to go on a trip after we graduated. And that trip morphed and evolved and turned into be a trip around the world. We went west. We got in a plane and we started off in Japan. We went all the way around the world, and almost right before we got back, we ended up in India. And we were on the Ganges, and it was glorious. We were deep in our trip. And at one point we took a turn, and all of a sudden we were alone, which is, you know, maybe not, we should have been signaled something was going to happen then, but we went down and there was just a pack of dogs, and I got nipped on the back of my left leg. And you can come and see that scar to this day. I consider it a tattoo. A tattoo of life, right? Turns out though that that dog was potentially had some infectious qualities to it. I might have gotten rabies, who knew? And so what did we do? Kim said, oh my God, we need to call my dad. So we did. We called Art, and he knew exactly what to do. He helped us, like he's helped so many around the world, to know what to do. It was practical, it was in the middle of the night for him, and it was dead on right. So I'm a person like so many who's alive today because he met me when I got back from my trip with new rabies vaccines and made sure that I was alive. And I'm not alone. We have several people who would like to share some remembrances of Art. Each of our speakers knows who they are. I have them on a list. While the person up here is sharing, before they start, I will tell you if you're next up. If you're next up, you're going to sit right here in the shade, ready to come right up to the podium. So our first speaker will be Jonathan Howard sharing a letter. The next person coming up is Jack Robinson. So Jack Robinson, if you could please make your way up and sit here, and we'll welcome Jonathan Howard, who will be sharing a letter.
Thanks again, everybody. I'm going to be reading a letter from Peter, or Pete as he was more commonly known. Pete Mayer was Arthur's cousin, and Pete and Arthur grew up together in Brooklyn, as you've heard, and they really were more like brothers. And so Pete has kindly sent this letter, and I'm privileged to just write and tell you guys about it. I had the privilege of meeting Pete when we went, I don't know how many years ago, we went on a family trip back to Brooklyn, and Art and Pete drove us around. We got a good slice of pizza, and they would just tell stories as we passed landmarks about what happened on this corner and what happened here. And it was a trip that I remember fondly. So this is from Pete. Art Ammann was my cousin and also the older brother I never had. His dad, Hans, was my mother's brother, and both were born in, I'm going to say this wrong, Tilfingen, Germany. Art's sister Mildred was the only girl cousin in the family and also a close friend, as close a friend as a sister that I never had. His mom and pop, Uncle Hans and Tante Marie, were my second set of parents, since they too spent many hours with me over at their home. My other cousin, Walt von Riesman, was 15 years older than me and 6 years older than Art. So he was working and going to college and not around all that much, but we kept in touch. That's the way it was back in the 40s and 50s. Foreign-born families remained close after going through Ellis Island, and us cousins did the same. We lived and grew up in good old Flatbush, Brooklyn. Art was 9 years older than me, but I was always very close to him and always walked up to his home on Avenue H and 37th Street, just 3 blocks up the road, any chance I got. Whenever I needed help with anything, Art was there and always had the answers. We spent many hours together cycling over Brooklyn to the beaches and Atlantic Ocean at Reese Park, to the libraries and to the museums which he loved, especially the two on Eastern Parkway, the Brooklyn Museum of Art and the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens. where Art worked a few times in the summer. Art graduated high school from Brooklyn Tech and went on to college, but we kept in touch. And when he came home for Christmas or the summer months, I was always there at his home the day after he arrived. He eventually became a doctor while I was born with a God-given talent to draw and paint. So I went to the Pratt Institute after graduating from Erasmus Hall High School. We went our separate ways, and Art and Marilyn wound up in California while I was hired by General Motors as a car designer in Michigan. I was drafted in 1967 and wound up in Vietnam in 68 and 69. And Arthur wrote to me a lot during that time. When I returned, I married Jan, who I had met at Pratt, and we drove out to California to visit Art and Marilyn in our new Pontiac Grand Am, which I let Arthur drive all over San Francisco. Boy, did he love that car. I've been working as a professional artist for the past 42 years, and I realized along the way that Art was more of a museum art lover than I ever was. And I told him in just about every phone conversation that he should have been the real artist in the family. And he always laughed and laughed. He was constantly going to fine art museums and loved taking his grandkids to show and explain the paintings, which he always related to me. I last saw Art in the fall of 2017 when he flew into the Butler Museum of Art to see my solo exhibit. We had a great time together. Prior to my arrival, the museum director took Art on a personal tour of the museum, which of course Art loved and told me all about. We had dinner and breakfast together and we shook hands. I drove back home to Pennsylvania and he flew back to San Rafael. However, the phone calls remained constant up until Kim called to tell me of Art's passing. It came as a shock since I had recently spoken with him, but I told my wife Jan and I called cousin Walt, who also took it extremely hard. Walt passed away recently as well. He was 92 and the oldest, so now it's me and their kids holding down the fort. I miss both of them, and especially Art. He really was the real older brother I never had. I'm very sorry I could not have been at this service, but I know Art would understand that I have an exhibit in Texas that I have to be at. I shed tears as I wrote this. Hang in there, dear Art and Walt. I will never forget our great times together. Pete Mayer.
Our next speaker will be Jack Robinson. Larry Hatfield, if you could please make your way up to the seat, that would be fabulous.
When Art and I were classmates at Wheaton College in the late 1950s, Art was only an acquaintance, even though we were both in classes together preparing for medical school. It was after graduation that we became friends. As our lives intersected increasingly, I began to think of Art as what my wife, Theo, calls a heart friend, a person with whom I felt I could say anything that was on my heart, and my words would find a sympathetic and understanding reception. Such friends are rare. I can count mine on two hands. To lose such a friend is a deeply painful experience. You already know the story of Art's research role and understand the nature of the HIV virus. What impressed me most was the fact that he went on to spend the rest of his life tirelessly advocating for treatments to reach the most marginalized communities in the world affected by the AIDS epidemic. One of the places where Art's team began working was in eastern Congo, where Theo and I had served as missionaries. It was that connection that increased my communication with Art and deepened our friendship. In 2008, Theo and I were teaching in a seminary in the Central African Republic on the northern border of Congo. There, the impact of AIDS had been devastating, and the churches were still poorly informed about how to deal helpfully and compassionately with victims of AIDS. I asked Art if he might possibly be able to come to the Central African Republic to conduct an AIDS conference for the Christian population in the capital city of Bangui and for the seminary students. To my surprise and delight, Art said yes. So in November of 2008, Art came with a team from the United States that included Gretchen Miller-Selfridge, who is here today. I think she's going to say something in a few minutes. He also brought 3 African health workers from Eastern Congo over a long, difficult journey from Goma to Bangui to be part of the conference staff. I will never forget the audible sigh of amazement from several hundred participants in the conference when these 3 Congolese were introduced. That they had come all that distance to help their brothers and sisters in Central African Republic learn how to better cope with the virus and how to treat its victims just blew that audience away. People from different tribes don't tend to do that. Art didn't stop with the conference in the capital city. When he learned about a nomadic tribe of people known as the Fulani, who had fled from violence elsewhere in Africa to a campsite just 25 miles outside of the capital, Art said, let's go and visit them. So we did. These people had a contaminated water supply, no health care, and a grass hut where they tried to provide some education for their children. These kids sat on 4-inch thick sapling tree trunks or branches, stripped of their branches, each end of which was rested on a forked stick in the ground. How those kids' bottoms could sit very long on those rough poles and learn anything still baffles me. Art hugged the men, laughed with almost everyone else, and brought hope to the village just by his very presence. As a result, a church in the capital city began an effort to help those people with their basic needs, help that lasted over the next several years. Art and I have been together a number of times since that African trip 14 years ago. I've tried to understand what it was about Art that touched me most deeply. I think it was his care for others. He didn't only care about his family and friends, or only about mothers and children, or only about Americans. I saw Art caring for people he'd never met before, in the most remote and impoverished situations you can imagine, in countries almost halfway around the world from his own. I also felt that care personally, a care that I think is really love, the kind of love he felt from Jesus and wanted others to experience as well. I had the privilege of knowing Art as a heart friend who indelibly marked my life with his love. And for him, and for that love, I shall always be profoundly grateful.
Larry Hatfield, are you here? Lily Z, could you please come and sit? You'll be after Larry.
I can't tell you the number of times that I've asked myself, how could a simple boy like me have a friend like Art Ammann? And I don't know exactly, but I can tell you some steps on how we met. Arlene and I first met Marilyn and Art when Lucia and David Gill organized a small group of 4 couples from church to meet regularly in their home. Then after that group broke up, couples moved away and we began to see each other at church and talk, and before long discovered our mutual interest in art. That is,